SEP Fanfic Readings presents 1,000 Words by Olive Juice 28. Chapter 60. Pomp and Circumstance. The big day had finally arrived, the culmination of everything they had worked for, and the castle's oldest students were fit to burst with excitement and anxiety, and all the other emotions that run rampant on such an occasion. The seventh years had opted to hold their reception in the courtyard, similar to the setup of the one following the memorial service, though on a smaller scale. The eighth years had gone all out for their gathering in the room. Once again, their familiar dormitory had been decorated and rearranged to accommodate the festivities that would be taking place within the magical walls. The couches and armchairs had been whisked away, while the center of the floor had been taken up with a massive buffet table, filled to overflowing with all manner of goodies, both savory and sweet. Each housemate had chosen one finger food and one dessert to be included in the menu, and the house elves had outdone themselves to fulfill the requests. There were traditional treats like mini steak and kidney pies, and tiny glasses filled with trifle, as well as some unusual offerings like small slices of pizza, Theo's insistent request, and bite-sized mango cakes, something Padma had been dying for ever since the luau. The area around the buffet was filled with small round tables, covered with linen cloths and sprinkled with glittery confetti in the house colors, providing more than enough seating for all the eighth years, their first years, and all the family and friends who had been invited. On each table, Hannah had placed 2 or 3 framed photos of the members of her house that she'd taken over the last 6 months. She had also chosen several whole group pictures to enlarge to poster size and display on 6 easels around the common area. There was the very first one she'd taken in January, one from Valentine's Day, one from the birthday party with all their young friends, one from the luau where they all sported their grass skirts and leis, and the most recent one from their final game night. Luna and Daphne had gathered small bouquets of flowers and put them in vases on each table as well, and had charmed almost 100 balloons in the 4 jewel tones to hang just above everyone's heads, but not float all the way up to the high arched ceiling. Anthony had decided that it would be nice to write something up about each of his friends and their plans for the future. Next to the fireplace where Hannah's last photograph was arranged, he placed a second, slightly smaller easel with a large piece of reinforced parchment, similar to the scoreboard that they had for tallying points. On it, he had listed each member of their 8th year, as well as a brief description of what they planned to do after leaving Hogwarts. He also included a teasing line about everyone, something that Theo had suggested and helped with. For example, next to Neville's name, read the following. Neville will be spending the summer in Switzerland, under the tutelage of Nitidus Spore, renowned plant expert and descendant of the famous herbologist Philidia Spore, who authored the still-used textbook 1,000 Magical Herbs and Fungi. In the fall, he plans to return to Hogwarts where he will earn his mastery under Professor Sprout, whose position he hopes to take over once she retires. He's a loyal friend, an excellent duelist, and a phenomenal dancer. Just don't ever ask him to draw any type of creature, magical or otherwise. Once the room was ready, they'd all scurried off to their chambers to get dressed for the ceremony. Traditional robes would be worn, but the headmistress had presented each of them with a sash to be draped over their shoulders. It was black, like the robes, but glittery cords of scarlet, gold, emerald, and sapphire created a border all the way around, and the Hogwarts crest was embroidered on each pointed end. Hermione was just securing the clip holding the sides of her hair back when a knock sounded on her door. She opened it to find her favorite wizard on the other side. "Hey," he greeted softly, the lopsided grin she loved so much gracing his handsome face. "Hey yourself," she smiled and popped up to press a kiss to his cheek. "You ready?" Draco nodded and brought an arm she hadn't noticed he tucked behind his back around, brandishing a beautiful bouquet of spring flowers. Her eyes widened with delighted surprise as she accepted them, immediately bringing them close to her face so she could inhale their sweet scent. "Thank you so much," she exclaimed, raising on tiptoe again, this time to deliver a more lingering kiss on his lips. When she pulled back, she saw the pink tinge on his cheeks that often followed an interaction like this, and it tugged at her heart a little. She would miss seeing him every day, sharing moments like this with him. She could feel her eyes begin to prickle and refuse to dampen the celebratory mood, instead spinning around to place her flowers in a conjured vase on her dresser. Once satisfied with their arrangement, she met him at the door again, where he offered a hand she gladly took, interlacing her fingers with his as they made their way to the space in front of the double doors, where the rest of their housemates were gathering. "We need a group photo," Hannah hollered, to which everyone responded with friendly groans and immediate shuffling into some semblance of an organized group. The camera clicked away from its spot on the tripod as they wiggled and shifted, fixed their hair and their sashes, and teased each other good-naturedly, before officially smiling and behaving for the real photo. While the former Hufflepuff always produced excellent images, everyone agreed that some of their favorites were the candid and unplanned ones, where laughter was genuine and expressions unguarded. With the photo op complete, the group headed out the doors and down to the chamber off the Great Hall, where they had convened before the memorial service. There, they met the 7th years, dressed in identical fashion and filled with the same nervous energy, ready to get the ball rolling. Once again, the tables had been removed from the vast space, and rows of chairs neatly lined the floor, with a center aisle running through them. The 7th years would file in and sit in the reserved rows on the left-hand side of the room, while the 8th years only needed the front row on the right-hand side. Immediately, behind them would be the 2 rows filled with their first years. The rest of the hall would be packed with family and friends of their graduates, as well as the rest of the student body, while the faculty would be seated in their traditional places on the platform. Hermione pushed a twinge of sadness aside as she gave Ginny a hug, trying not to feel envious of everyone around her who had people seated out there that they had invited. She knew Harry and the entire Weasley family would be in attendance, but they were there for Ginny more than for her. Draco had told Narcissa and Andromeda would be there, and that they had hoped she'd visit them at their reception, which she most definitely would, but again, they weren't her family. She and Theo had joked a little about sticking together that day, but she knew he'd split his time between Luna and her father, and the Greengrass family, who he'd always been close to. She'd gotten very good at stuffing down the longing and disappointment she felt about not having her parents around, but in moments like this, it was especially hard. Before she could dwell on it any further, McGonagall was lining them up in alphabetical order, and telling them that when their name was called, they would walk up the left side of the stage, accept their scroll, shake hands with her, the 4 heads of house, and the minister, before walking down the right side and returning to their seats. With a crisp nod of her head, the older witch breezed through the door, the 7th years following in her wake. As they filed into their seats, Hermione caught the eyes of her young charges. Allison and Darla were seated together, smiling and waving their fingers from their laps. Malcolm was a few chairs away, next to Christopher and Aidan, and he shot her a grin as she reached her spot. A few rows behind the younger students, she caught a glimpse of the sea of red hair and knew the Weasleys were there. She fought the urge to turn around and look for Harry, knowing it would only earn her a stern glare from the headmistress, who was a stickler for propriety in such situations. A brief welcome was given by McGonagall, and then Kingsley said a few words about how proud he was of all of the students being recognized that day. He encouraged them to continue the great work they'd begun in helping to move the wizarding world forward in a positive direction, and said he looked forward to seeing what the future held for each side of them. When he finished, Kingsley stepped to the side, where he was joined by Professor Sprout, Professor Slughorn, Professor Flitwick, and Professor Weasley, who had been head of the house for both Gryffindor and the 8th years. McGonagall stepped up to the podium again and explained that she would be reading the names of the 7th years first. Draco allowed his mind to wander as the younger graduates stepped up to receive their scrolls and handshakes. It was hard to imagine that a year ago he'd been sitting in a cell in Azkaban, waiting his trial. A year ago he was still convinced he'd never set foot outside the prison, much less have a future full of possibilities in front of him. It was a humbling thought, and he was immensely grateful for the leniency he'd been shown and the second chance he'd been given. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so optimistic. He snuck a sideways glance a few seats away and observed Hermione for a moment. A small smile turned up the corners of her mouth as she watched their schoolmates parade across the stage. He was still a little nervous about the reunion that would take place once the ceremony was over, although much less so than he'd been previously. The Grangers really were terrific, and he'd felt an almost instant connection with them the day before. He knew that had a lot to do with the fact that they were both reminded him so much of his favorite witch, but he also knew it was more than that. They had accepted him with open arms, something he'd rarely experienced in his lifetime, especially from perfect strangers. He looked forward to getting to know them better in the days to come, and was also hoping there'd be an opportunity to introduce them to his mother at some point later that afternoon. As Ginny Weasley made her way across the platform, the last of the 7th year class, McGonagall asked that all 30-some of them stand and be recognized. The hall erupted with cheers, wolf whistles, and loud applause as the group of young witches and wizards hugged and high-fived before settling back down in their seats. The headmistress cleared her throat and directed her attention to the 10 eldest students in the room. After introducing the 8th year group as a whole, she began to read their names. When Hermione's turn came, she accepted her scroll from her favorite professor and couldn't help but give the usual stern witch a quick hug, which she was pleased to have returned in kind. She also received hugs from each of the heads, as well as Kingsley. As she made her way back down to her seat, she caught Draco's gaze first, and he sent her a wink, which she answered with a beaming smile. She then glanced quickly towards where the Weasley clan was, and met Ron's grin before scanning the seats around him for Harry, but he didn't seem to be nearby. Curious as to where he'd be sitting, she didn't get more than a second to ponder that before she sank back into the chair, only to be greeted by quiet whispers of "Congratulations!" and pats on her shoulder from the first years behind her. She watched as Draco's name was called, and he strode confidently up to the podium, where he accepted his scroll and a few extra words from McGonagall, before turning to the other faculty members. He saw Bill give him a hearty slap on the back as he shook his hand, and Kingsley held on to him a little longer than most of the others. His dark eyes focused on the tall blonde. His mouth turned up in a kind smile as he spoke quietly. Her heart swelled with pride for the young man before her. Gone were all vestiges of the sneering, arrogant, prejudiced bully who once tormented and belittled everyone unfortunate enough to cross his path. In his place remained a kind, passionate, brilliant, and quick-witted wizard who had fully captured her heart. Though she was still missing her parents, she was filled with happiness at all she and her friends had accomplished this year, and not just academically. Once again, as the final graduate crossed the platform, McGonagall asked their group to stand, and the space around them was filled with boisterous celebration. As they sat back down, introductions were given to the students and guests in attendance. Students not related to the graduates were expected to return to their dormitories, except for the first years who'd been granted permission to attend the party in the room. 7th years and their guests were to make their way to the courtyard, while 8th years and their guests should head to the room of requirement. Much scraping of chairs and shuffling of feet occurred, as everyone attempted to do as they were bid. Theo rallied their young friends to himself and led them out of the great hall, as the rest of the older students sought out their family and their friends to show them the way. Before Hermione had a chance to take more than 2 steps, she was engulfed by a familiar set of arms and shock of red hair. "Ron!" "Hey, congratulations!" he pulled back, smiling wildly, and she looked over his shoulder to see the rest of his family gathered around. "Thank you so much," she replied, as she moved to receive the hug George was waiting to bestow her. "Knew you'd manage," the lanky jokester teased. "Had us worried for a bit, you know, with that dreadful you'd received in potions and all." She laughed and poked him in the ribs, and he tugged on one of her curls before passing her off to Molly, who enveloped her in a massive embrace, Arthur joining in along with her. She couldn't exactly hear what they were saying, but she understood the sentiments to be of well wishes and love. She appreciated them tremendously. Percy shook her hand formally, and Charlie gave her a one-armed squeeze before the whole gang headed off to find Ginny in the courtyard. Catching her breath from the whirlwind the large family often was, she glanced around to see most of the hall was empty, except for Draco, who was standing a few feet away with his mother and aunt, and another man she didn't recognize. "Hello," she greeted them warmly as she approached the small group. She hugged both Narcissa and Andromeda affectionately before turning to the elderly wizard. "I'm Hermione." She extended her hand, and he clasped it with both of his own, a kind smile on his face. "Very pleased to meet you, my dear." He patted her hand. "My name is Alcott Black. I'm a distant relation to the family." He nodded at the 2 sisters and tilted his head towards Draco, who smiled in return. Hermione realized then that she hadn't had a chance to officially congratulate her boyfriend yet, and turned her attention fully on him. "Well, I guess we did it!" He chuckled and gathered her in his arms, giving her a squeeze and placing a kiss on the top of her curls. "That we did." He pulled back but kept his hands on her shoulders and leveled his gaze at hers. "I have, well, there's something—" He wasn't sure quite how to word the next bit, but his girlfriend was otherwise distracted as she asked him a question. "Where's Harry? I haven't seen him yet." Her warm brown eyes were sparkling with joy even as her brow furrowed slightly at the thought of her missing best friend. "Well, funny you should ask." He gently turned her around, keeping his hands firmly on her shoulders as she took in the sight of 3 very familiar people who had walked up to stand behind her. Absolute silence reigned for several long seconds as Hermione registered the fact that her parents were there. Her mother, tears coursing down her cheeks, one hand covering her mouth, the other gripping Harry's arm. Her father, his own eyes glistening as he wrapped his arm around his wife's shoulders. A smile stretched his kind face. "Mum?" she whispered incredulously. "Dad?" They both nodded, and that was all it took for her to lunge forward with a sob and fling herself into their arms. The little family drew tightly together, while everyone else moved considerately off to the side. Harry and Draco shifted a few chairs into a small circle so the 5 of them could sit and wait while the Grangers had their moment. "Congratulations." Harry held his hand out to Draco, who shook it with a nod and a wavering sigh as he watched his girlfriend and her parents. "Thanks," he said sincerely. "Not sure if I'm more relieved to be done with school or that we pulled this off." Harry gave a wry chuckle. "Too right, mate." Narcissa and Andromeda were both dabbing at their eyes with white lace handkerchiefs, and Alcott simply looked very pleased with everything that had transpired. Quiet conversation began to flow, and after a while they noticed the Grangers had pulled apart just enough to continue talking, though arms were still wrapped around each other and sniffles were heard every few seconds. Andromeda was just explaining to Draco that Teddy was spending the afternoon with Mary when Professor McGonagall came through the doors, her sharp gaze taking stock of those left in the great hall. Upon comprehending that it was Hermione and her parents standing in the middle of the floor, the headmistress veered in the direction of Draco's group instead. "It's all gone well, then?" she asked softly, with everyone nodding in affirmation. "Wonderful!" She sighed and gave a small smile. "You know you are all welcome to head up to the room for the reception." She looked specifically at Narcissa when she spoke, wanting the elegant woman to know that she was included in that invitation. "Yes, thank you, Professor," Draco said, tipping his head towards the trio of brunettes. "We'll give them a few more minutes and see if they want to join us before we make our way there." Narcissa nodded and smiled gratefully at the headmistress as her son spoke. With that, McGonagall bid them farewell and swept out the other door in the direction of the courtyard. Just a short while later, Edward, Jeanette, and Hermione approached them, eyes still red and faces still blotchy, but beaming smiles more than making up for it. Draco stood as Hermione came near her, and she launched herself into his arms, her curls all but suffocating him as she whispered a tearful mantra of "thank you" and "I love you," over and over again. He wrapped his arms around her and fought back his own emotions as a wave of relief and gratitude crashed over him. He knew there were lots of conversations that would need to take place in the days to come, but for now he was simply glad it had turned out well and that she had her parents back. Harry was the next to receive an all-encompassing embrace, and as he held on to his best friend, he met Edward and Jeanette's eyes over her shoulder and answered their watery smiles with one of his own. Lots of hugs, handshakes, and introductions took place in the next several minutes, and once everyone had been acquainted and tears had been dried, they decided that they should head to the party in the room, lest their housemates and first years begin to worry about their absence.